Welcome to another edition of the Powell Press. This is week 8 of the 2023 legislative session, the week of April 24th. And boy, do I have some important information to share with you. This week, we discuss diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as legislation that I've passed through the legislature this week and a number of other topics. Let's get right into it. This week started Budget Conference. Budget Conference is the process in which the House and the Senate get together to look at the final numbers of the state budget before it goes to the governor's desk. On Monday, there were confirmation hearings that began in the Senate Ethics and Elections Committee. One of the individuals who was on the list of appointees was Christopher Rufo. Rufo, an extremely controversial figure who has made his fortune attacking the teaching of Black history and the LGBTQ community, was appointed by the governor to the board of trustees at New College of Florida. Mr. Rufo did not appear in person, but a combative and conservative surrogate, Eddie Spear, did. He's also a trustee who was appointed by the governor on the board of New College of Florida. I'm happy to report that on Tuesday, Senate Bill 430, legislation which would establish the Historic Cemeteries Program within the Department of State Division of Historic Resources, unanimously passed the Senate Appropriations Committee. This was the final committee hearing for this legislation, which is intended to identify forgotten graves in Florida, especially African American burial sites, and ensure the dignity and respect of the deceased. The bill now awaits final vote in the Senate. Also on Tuesday, my legislation, theft of nonprofits or from nonprofits, passed through the Senate Fiscal Policy Committee. This legislation would, of course, toughen penalties for anyone who decided to steal from a 501c3. It passed through the Fiscal Policy Committee on Tuesday and subsequently passed through the full Senate on Friday. It now goes over to the House for final passage. On Wednesday, we were on the Senate floor and the better part of the day was taken up with questions on legislation which removes the restrictions on the governor's expected run president, but it slaps more restrictions on the voters of Florida who will be casting their votes. Senate Bill 7050 clarifies a resign to run requirement in state law for individuals who are running for president or vice president. At the same time, the bill threatens a new round of disenfranchisement. It increases penalties for third-party voters registration organizations, shortens the time frame for voters to request mail ballots, and fails to impose the same requirements for turning in registrations to the supervisor of elections as imposed on the third-party voters organizations. And among other controversial provisions, this legislation passed through the Senate. And of course, I voted against this legislation as well as many of my Democratic colleagues because I believe that one disenfranchised voter is one too many. Also on Wednesday, it brought a glimmer of hope for property owners struggling under rising property insurance rates as the Senate unanimously passed Senate Bill 7052, Insurer Accountability. This measure finally offers some help for consumers in Florida who have been hammered by rising premiums and a governor who's eager to please the insurance industry. The legislation includes more insurer accountability and some consumer protections. It is well overdue and hopefully the first step to actually bringing rates down here in the state of Florida. On Wednesday night, I had the pleasure of participating in a student town hall with lawmakers where students shared their issues and concerns with the Florida legislators. The town hall presented a great atmosphere for open communication and dialogue, student engagement, transparency, and problem solving, along with some community building. What an exciting night it was on Wednesday night to meet with the students. Thursday brought a new round of anti-immigration legislation. Senate Bill 1718 / Committee Substitute 1617 in the Florida House came before the Senate. Included in this bill is mandatory reporting of someone's immigration status if they seek hospital treatment, removing the ability to be admitted to practice law in Florida if you are undocumented, and a mandatory e-verify if a company has more than 25 employees. The sponsor of the bill insisted that these harsh measures are needed because immigrants are coming across the southern border, but conceded he had no data showing that Florida actually suffered from an influx of immigrants or suffered from having a southern border. Thursday also brought a renewed round of attacks in the governor's woke wars. This time, Senate Bill 266 and university spending on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, despite a lack of studies that actually look at how these draconian policies may be adding to Florida's brain drain and driving people away from this state, sponsors of the legislation are insisting that cracking down on intellectual freedom will actually create, ready for this, greater intellectual freedom. Interesting point that you defeated in your own legislation. Now, they can't answer my question that if you limit certain controversies or conversations, doesn't that stifle academic freedom? The bill passed along party lines. On Friday, legislation that Democrats had opposed earlier in the week, namely the Immigration and Protections of Medical Conscience legislation that allowed medical professionals to refuse care if it violates their personal beliefs, passed the Senate along party lines. This brings us to next week. Next week is week 9 of the 2023 legislative session, the final week. We are still in full swing. The budget negotiations between the House and Senate are coming to an end, and the final balanced budget must be placed on lawmakers' desks by Tuesday in order to allow for the mandatory 72-hour cooling off period and to finish session by midnight on Friday. Now, remember, passing a balanced state budget is the only constitutional duty that lawmakers are required to complete during the annual legislative session, which ends this year on May 5th. Now, to track legislative action throughout the 2023 legislative session, please visit flsenate.gov, fill in the bill number in the search box, and scroll down to last action. That is all for this week's edition of the Powell Press. Please join us next week for week 9. But remember, before doing that, go ahead and hit like and share this particular video. And also, you can find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and all other forms of not TikTok. We already banned that. But all other forms of social media, you can find us. Make sure you check us out. Remember this, that a life of service is a life that counts. And I'll see you next week for week 9 of the 2023 legislative session. Thank you. So long.